Chapter 3. Texts and Contexts. Paul's texts are letters written by a leader to the groups he has started or backed. They cover a very brief period, from 50 to 58. They are militant documents sent to small groups of the converted. In no way are they narratives in the manner of the Gospels, or theoretical treatises of the kind later written by the Church Fathers, or lyrical prophecies such as the Apocalypse attributed to John. They are interventions. From this point of view, they are more akin to the texts of Lenin than to Marx's Capital, or to the majority of texts by Lacan than to Freud's interpretation of dreams, or to Wittgenstein's lectures than to Russell's Principia Mathematica. This format, in which the opportunity for action takes precedent over the preoccupation with making a name for oneself through publications, publication, as Lacan used to say, evinces one of the anti-philosopher's characteristic traits. He writes neither system nor treatise, nor even really a book. He propounds a speech of rupture, and writing ensues when necessary. The enigma lies mainly in knowing how these topical texts were bequeathed to us, and what was responsible for their solemn and suspicious inclusion within that untouchable corpus known as the New Testament. The canonical collection of Paul's epistles is late. It probably dates from the end of the 2nd century. The oldest copies we possess come from the beginning of the 3rd century and consist only of fragments. Moreover, as we indicated earlier, out of the 13 letters contained in the New Testament, at least 6 are certainly apocryphal, even if it seems probable that some of these originated from within Paul's entourage. Why and how did this corpus come to be canonized? Remember that Paul has no obvious historical legitimacy. He is not one of the 12 apostles. He knew nothing of the Lord's life. He caused many problems for the historical center in Jerusalem. 4 important remarks may illuminate this oddity. 1. Contrary to the persistent illusion harbored by the New Testament's canonical, multi-secular order and imposed on our spontaneous opinion, we will never tire of repeating that Paul's epistles predate by a long way the composition of the Gospels. Better still, Paul's epistles are quite simply the oldest Christian texts to be handed down to us. Of course, oral accounts of Christ's life, of his miracles, of his death, must have been abundantly propagated at the time of Paul's preaching. But no document establishing the details of that history has come down to us written prior to the year 70, which is to say, about 10 years after Paul's death. If one dates the first epistle to the Thessalonians from 50, which is plausible, a 20-year gap separates it from the writing of the first gospel, Mark's. Consequently, Paul enjoys a palpable anteriority so far as the written propagation of the Christian doctrine is concerned. And because his letters were copied and circulated very early on, it would probably have been difficult to simply ignore them when the time came, much later at the end of the 3rd century, to collect the new religion's founding documents. 2. With the partial exception of John's, which was written last, possibly around 90, the Gospels provide a genuine contrast to Paul's epistles, one to which we shall have occasion to return. Their aim is obviously to emphasize Jesus' exploits, his life's exceptional singularity. All the trusted staples of religious thaumaturgy and charlatanism are abundantly mobilized. Miraculous cures, walking on water, divinations and announcements, resuscitation of the dead, abnormal meteorological phenomena, laying on of hands, instantaneous multiplication of victuals. Jesus' style, as recounted to us by the Gospels, is in complete accordance with this itinerant magician's paraphernalia. Certainly the choiceness of its aphorisms, and its shaping of the will to rupture render it brilliant. Yet, for all that, it is no less marked by the conventions of the genre. Parables with a double meaning, obscure metaphors, apocalyptic imagery, carefully constructed undecidability as to the character's identity. Prophet, Messiah, messenger of God, son of God, new God descended on earth. Paul's texts retain almost nothing of all this, in spite of the fact that it must have been recounted in abundant detail among Christians of the first generation. It has often been noted that the empirical life of Jesus practically goes unmentioned in the epistles, as do all of the Master's famous parables. Jesus' teachings, like his miracles, are splendidly ignored. Everything is brought back to a single point. Jesus, Son of God, we shall see what this means, and Christ, in virtue of this, died on the cross and was resurrected. The rest, all the rest, is of no real importance. Let us go further. The rest, what Jesus said and did, is not what is real in conviction, but obstructs or even falsifies it. Only a concentrated style, shorn of the mannerisms of prophetic and thaumaturgical literature, can be appropriate to such a reduction. There is no doubt that Paul is a superlative writer, condensed, lapidary, knowing just when to unleash unusual and powerful images. Certain passages, as the poet Henri Badiou pointed out to us, combining a kind of violent abstraction with ruptures in tone designed to put pressure on the reader to deprive him of all respite, resemble Shakespearean declamations. But ultimately, what matters so far as this prose is concerned is argumentation and delimitation, the forceful extraction of an essential core of thought. Consequently, there will be no parables, no learned obscurities, no subjective indecision, no veiling of truth. The paradox of faith must be brought out as it is, borne by prose into the light of its radical novelty. The result of all this is that Paul's epistles are the only truly doctrinal texts in the New Testament. One understands why, for example, Luther considered that Paul's epistles, and they alone, contained the meaning of the revelation, and he did not hide his low opinion of the synoptic Gospels, especially Luke's. Without Paul's texts, the Christian message would remain ambiguous, with little to distinguish it from the overabundant prophetic and apocalyptic literature of the time. This is an important reason for their inclusion within the canonical corpus. 3. What happened between the writing of Paul's texts and that of the Gospels? A crucial event, the Jewish uprising against the Roman occupier, erupting in 66, very probably after Paul's death, and culminating with Titus's destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70. This marks the true beginning of Jewish diaspora. Above all, it marks the end of Jerusalem's central significance for the Christian movement. Henceforth begins the process that will, little by little, turn Rome into the true capital of Christianity, and historically erase that Jewish and Oriental origin of which Jerusalem, where the historic apostles resided, was the symbol. Now, in several regards, it is Paul who, by virtue of his universal and decentered vision of the construction of Christian enclaves, can be considered the genuine precursor for this displacement. There is no doubt that, for him, the structure of the Roman Empire, which means the world between the Orient and Spain, is more important than the preeminence of Jerusalem. That the most developed, most carefully crafted, most decisive of all his texts, especially so far as the break with Jewish law is concerned, was an epistle to the Romans, is an instance of the kind of fortuitousness whose symbolic function is irrecusable. Another major reason for inscribing Paul within the official corpus. 4. It is common knowledge that an organization puts together the compendium of its canonical texts when the time has come for it to secure its orientation against dangerous deviations or struggle against threatening divisions. In this regard, the first centuries of Christianity are particularly fraught. So far as the question preoccupying us here is concerned, it is essential to take into account the upsurge of a heresy that one could call ultra-Pauline, that of Marcion at the beginning of the 2nd century. Marcion, providing the cue for the long succession of heresies of Manichaean tendency, maintains that the break between Christianity and Judaism, between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament, must be considered to be absolute in a precise sense. It is not the same God who is in question in these two religions. The Old Testament deals with the God who created the world, and that God, as a consideration of the world as it is clearly establishes, is a malevolent being. Above this creator God, there exists a genuinely good God, whose character is that of a father and not a creator. We can say that, for Marcion, it is necessary to distinguish the symbolic father revealed through Christianity alone from the creator, or real father. The God of Christianity, the symbolic father, is not known in the same sense as the God of the Old Testament, the progenitor. The latter is directly apprehensible through the narrative of his dark and capricious misdeeds. The former, which the world provides no trace of, and who, for that reason, cannot be known directly, or known according to the style of narrative, is accessible only through the coming of his Son. The result is that the Christian news is, purely and simply, the true God's mediating revelation, the event of the Father, which at the same time denounces the deception of that Creator God whom the Old Testament tells us about. Marcion's treatise, which has not been handed down to us, was called the Antitheses. A crucial point. In it, he maintained that Paul was the only authentic apostle. The other so-called apostles, with Peter at their head, remained under the auspice of the dark creator God. There were certainly good reasons why the heretic could enlist the apostle of nations in this way. Chief among them, Paul's struggle against the strictly observant Judeo-Christians, his eventual conception of Christianity, and his polemic about the deathly aspect of the law. By pushing a little, one could arrive at Marcion's conception. The new gospel is an absolute beginning. Nevertheless, there is no question but that this was an instance of manipulation. There is no text of Paul's from which one could draw anything resembling Marcion's doctrine. That the God whose Son is Jesus Christ is the God spoken of in the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, is, for Paul, a ceaselessly reiterated and obvious fact. If there is a figure with whom Paul feels an affinity, and one whom he subtly uses to his own ends, it is that of Abraham. That Paul emphasizes rupture rather than continuity with Judaism is not in doubt, but this is a militant and not an ontological thesis. Divine unicity bridges the two situations separated by the Christ event, and at no moment is it cast into doubt. In order to combat Marcion's dangerous heresy, which in fact abruptly backtracked on the Jerusalem Compromise and threatened to turn Christianity into a sect devoid of all historical depth, the Church Fathers must have set out a reasonable and centrist version of Paul in opposition to ultra-Paulinism. The construction of the official Paul probably dates from here, a construction that is not devoid of various doctrines and deviations. The truth is that we know Marcion only through his orthodox opponents, either Irenaeus or Jerome. And correspondingly, Paul came to be known through this image of Paul that it was necessary to construct in opposition to those who, in accordance with an extremist vision of the Christian rupture, appropriated the founder's most radical statements. Herein lies a partial explanation for the inclusion of Paul's epistles within the final corpus. Better for the church, which was in the process of consolidating itself, to have a reasonable Paul on its side than to have a Paul entirely turned over to the side of heresy. Nevertheless, this does not exclude the possibility that, on behalf of the cause, and by doctoring the genuine texts and fabricating false ones, the apostle came to be more or less rectified, or his radicalism tempered at the very least. An operation in which, as we saw earlier, the author of the Acts was already engaged at the end of the 1st century. But in spite of everything, when one reads Paul, one is stupefied by the paucity of traces left in his prose by the era, genres, and circumstances. There is in this prose, under the imperative of the event, something solid and timeless, something that, precisely because it is a question of orienting a thought toward the universal in its suddenly emerging singularity, but independently of all anecdote, is intelligible to us without having to resort to cumbersome historical mediations, which is far from being the case for many passages in the Gospels, let alone for the opaque apocalypse. No one has better illuminated the uninterrupted contemporaneousness of Paul's prose than one of the greatest poets of our time, Pier Paolo Pasolini, who, it must be said, with his 2 first names, was at the heart of the problem, through the signifier alone. Pasolini, for whom the question of Christianity intersected with that of communism, or alternatively, the question of saintliness intersected with that of the militant, wanted to make a film about St. Paul transplanted into the contemporary world. The film was never made, but we possess a detailed script for it, one that was translated into French and published by Flammarion. Pasolini's aim was to turn Paul into a contemporary without modifying any of his statements. He wanted to restore, in the most direct, most violent way, the conviction of Paul's intrinsic actuality. It was a question of explicitly telling the spectator that it was possible to imagine Paul among us, here, today, in his full physical existence. That it is our society Paul is addressing. That it is for us he weeps, threatens, and forgives, attacks, and tenderly embraces. He wanted to say, Paul is our fictional contemporary because the universal content of his preaching, obstacles and failures included, remains absolutely real. For Pasolini, Paul, in revolutionary fashion, wanted to destroy a model of society based on social inequality, imperialism, and slavery. There resides in him the holy will to destruction. Certainly in the film, as envisioned, Paul fails, and this failure is even more internal than public. But he pronounces the truth of the world, and does so in the same unaltered terms in which he spoke almost 2,000 years ago. Pasolini's thesis is threefold. 1. Paul is our contemporary because the sudden irruption of chance, the event, the pure encounter, are always at the origin of a saintliness. Moreover, today, the figure of the saint is necessary, even if the contents of the initiating encounter may vary. 2. By transplanting Paul along with all his statements into our century, one sees them encountering there a real society every bit as criminal and corrupt, but infinitely more supple and resistant than that of the Roman Empire. 3. Paul's statements are endowed with a timeless legitimacy. The central theme is situated in the relation between actuality and saintliness. Whenever the world of history tends to escape into mystery, abstraction, pure interrogation, it is the world of the divine, of saintliness, which, eventally descended among humans, becomes concrete, operative. The film script charts the trajectory of a saintliness within an actuality. How is the transposition effected? Rome is New York, capital of American imperialism. Jerusalem, cultural seat occupied by the Romans, seat also of intellectual conformity, is Paris under the German heel. The small, nascent Christian community is represented by the resistance, while the Pharisees are the Pétainists. Paul is French, from a comfortable bourgeois background, a collaborator, hunting members of the resistance. Damascus is the Barcelona of Franco's Spain. The fascist Paul goes on a mission to see supporters of Franco. On the road to Barcelona, traveling through southwestern France, he has an illumination. He joins the camp of the anti-fascist resistance. We then follow him as he travels around preaching resistance in Italy, in Spain, in Germany. Athens, the Athens of the sophists who refused to listen to Paul, is represented by contemporary Rome, by those petty Italian intellectuals and critics whom Pasolini detested. Finally, Paul goes to New York, where he is betrayed, arrested, and executed in sordid circumstances. The principal aspect in this trajectory gradually becomes that of betrayal, its wellspring being that what Paul creates, the church, the organization, the party, turns against his own inner saintliness. Here, Pasolini finds support in a major tradition, one we shall examine later, that sees in Paul not so much a theoretician of the Christian event as the tireless creator of the church, a man of the institution, in short, a militant of the Third International. For Pasolini, reflecting on communism through Paul, the party is what, little by little, inverts saintliness into priesthood through the narrow requirements of militantism. How does genuine saintliness, which Pasolini unhesitatingly recognizes in Paul, bear the ordeal of a history that is at once fleeting and monumental, one in which it constitutes an exception rather than an operation? It can only do so by hardening itself, by becoming authoritarian and organized. But that hardness, which is supposed to preserve it from all corruption by history, reveals itself to be an essential corruption, that of the saint by the priest. It is the almost necessary movement of an internal betrayal. And this internal betrayal is captured by an external betrayal, so that Paul will be denounced. The traitor is St. Luke, portrayed as an agent of the devil, writing the Acts of the Apostles in an unctuous and emphatic style with the aim of eradicating saintliness. Such is Pasolini's interpretation of the Acts. It is a question of writing Paul's life as if all he had ever been was a priest. The Acts, and more generally the official image of Paul, present us with the saint erased by the priest. This is a falsification because Paul is a saint. But the film script allows us to understand the truth behind this deception. In Paul, the immanent dialectic of saintliness and actuality constructs a subjective figure of the priest. Paul also dies to the extent that saintliness has darkened within him. A saintliness immersed in an actuality such as that of the Roman Empire, or equally that of contemporary capitalism, can protect itself only by creating, with all requisite severity, a church. But this church turns saintliness into priesthood. The most surprising thing in all this is the way in which Paul's texts are transplanted unaltered, and with an almost unfathomable naturalness, into the situations in which Pasolini deploys them: war, fascism, American capitalism, the petty debates of the Italian intelligentsia, the universal value of the core of Paul's thought, as well as of the timelessness of his prose, successfully undergoes this artistic trial, and Paul whole emerges strangely victorious.